without further ado, I will give the floor to President Costa.
Bien, bonjour. Permettez-moi de commencer par remercier chaleureusement la France pour l'organisation de ces sommets, ainsi que le président Emmanuel Macron pour son engagement et leadership dont il a fait preuve tout au long de sa préparation. Je salue vivement l'initiative du président Macron d'engager les discussions sur une croissance mondiale équilibrée en associant l'ensemble des acteurs clés. Les grandes économies doivent désormais prendre leurs responsabilités. L'Union européenne fait sa part. Nous renforçons notre capacité à investir pour être plus compétitifs et plus autonomes. En mettant en œuvre l'agenda Une Europe, un marché et notre programme de simplification, nous créons un environnement attractif pour l'investissement. En avançant dans la construction d'une véritable union de l'épargne et des investissements et en créant le nouveau Fonds européen par la compétitivité, nous créons des instruments concrets pour investir. Ensuite, nous travaillons en étroite collaboration avec nos partenaires mondiaux. Je salue la décision d'élargir les discussions de ces sommets à des partenaires du monde entier. Les dirigeants de l'Inde, du Brésil, de la Corée du Sud, du Kenya et de l'Égypte participeront à une partie de nos discussions et ces pays ont contribué aux travaux préparatoires. L'Union européenne développe un réseau d'accords commerciaux le plus vaste au monde, couvrant déjà 84 pays à travers la planète. Ces accords ne sont pas des simples instruments économiques. Ils constituent des véritables passerelles favorisant la coopération, l'innovation et la prospérité partagée. Ces accords contribuent également à la défense du multilatéralisme
The European Union is firmly attached to sustainable development goals and to eradicating poverty. The time has come to overcome, to move beyond the traditional donor-beneficiary relationship, to move into mutually beneficial, equal-footed partnerships, and to rethink cooperation for development and rethink the international financial architecture. And therefore, the program launched by Ms. van der Leyen called Global Gateways is truly exemplary. The G7 summit will also focus on other priorities that warrant very strong action. We will, for example, discuss our coordinated response to the Ebola epidemic in the DRC and Uganda. The G7 group is mobilizing health and human resources and capacities to help those countries that are affected by the disease in order to stop its propagation. This is a global issue, and the EU will strengthen its support, will continue to work very closely with its international partners. And one last word on another shared priority. It is shared between the EU and the French G7 presidency, and that is the safety, online safety of our children and teens. Digital technologies offer amazing possibilities, but they also have led to new risks for children and teenagers. And so we will be holding a discussion with the leaders of the world's major technology companies, and this will be a perfect occasion to talk about everyone's responsibility in fostering a safer digital environment for our young people and our children. This G7 meeting is taking place at a very crucial time. No country can face these challenges and cope with them alone. And what will be decided here will send a very strong signal about our dedication, our decision to act and to maintain international stability. And therefore, against this backdrop, peace is an existential priority. President Zelensky will take part in our discussion on Russia's aggression of Ukraine, and it is indeed a very important participation. That conflict has now outlasted the First World War. It is a huge challenge, and we know that fighting is getting starker. And the countries here represented at the G7 can contribute to finding an agreement towards lasting peace. And today we are taking a historic step towards the integration of Ukraine into the European Union, that will have to begin formal negotiations. This mirrors the amazing reforms that Ukraine has been able to introduce in very difficult times, and I think it also testifies to the EU's members' agreement to opening up the EU. Russia must understand and will understand that time is not in its favor. Playing for time will not benefit it, and that it is urgent to begin negotiations for a just and lasting peace. There is another important topic that will be dealt with at this summit, and that is the situation in Iran and the Middle East, which we will discuss in the presence of a number of regional leaders, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And I welcome the agreement that was just announced between Washington and Tehran. And I do hope that this will put an end to a very costly war and will allow the full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz with freedom of navigation, and will also restore or lead to full sovereignty for Lebanon. The EU is prepared to contribute to putting together an entire solid framework for lasting peace in the Middle East. So this opens up hope, but it should not allow us to forget the tragic humanitarian situation in Gaza and the very big concern over illegal occupation in the West Bank. For a just and lasting peace in the region, we need to be able to progress along the only path possible, i.e. the two-state solution. I am certain, I'm confident that the discussions that will take place in Évian, led under the leadership of President Macron, will allow us to take some very broad steps forward on these issues. Thank you very much for your attention.
G7 in Évian under the French presidency. And indeed, we meet against the backdrop of geopolitical fragmentation, economic reconfiguration, and a rapid technological change. Our main goal here is, on one hand, to address the structural challenges of the global economy, specifically global imbalances and overcapacities. And on the other hand, we want to focus on crises that are all affecting all of us: the war in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, and indeed Ebola. So we will have a packed agenda, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with the G7 leaders and the guest countries that you all named. Let me start with the structural topic. A key topic for this year's G7 is global economic imbalances. This means that some countries produce too much and do not consume enough, and of course the inverse. And these dynamics are increasingly dangerous for the stability of the global economy. That's why I very much welcome President Macron's focus on this topic, not at least because it is increasingly becoming relevant for the European Union. If you look at the year 2025, this will be remembered as the year where for the first time ever, all member states had a trade deficit with China. The European Union recorded its largest ever trade deficit of 360 billion euros. This is, of course, not sustainable. As you know, in Europe, our strategy is very clear: de-risk, not decouple. And concretely, this means we really have to step up and accelerate building domestic capacity on one hand. And on the other hand, we have to weave our worldwide net of free trade agreements, because this is the means to diversify our supply chains. At the same time, we also need to protect our market from unfair practices. Over the last years, we have developed and deployed our toolbox, from safeguards to anti-subsidy measures, to address unfair competition and even cases of coercion. In the G7, there is a general understanding that unity and coordination among G7 is paramount in this topic. We all experience the same patterns in our economies. Take, for example, the topic of critical raw materials. We need to come together to achieve the adequate scale for these critical raw materials. And this is why we're working with the G7 and other partner countries on a critical raw material agreement. Unity is the precondition for G7 to achieve a level playing field globally. Now, moving from structural challenges to the ongoing crises, we will discuss the situation in the Middle East. And let me start also by welcoming the agreement reached between the United States and Iran. The priority now is implementation. The Straits of Hormuz must reopen, and freedom of navigation must be restored, toll-free. This is essential for the regional stability and, of course, also for the global economy. The agreement should open the door to wider talks and lead to the end of Iran's nuclear and ballistic programs. And let me also underline that there can be no lasting peace while Lebanon remains in flames. We call for a genuine ceasefire and the full respect for Lebanon's sovereignty. This crisis also carries a clear lesson. Once again, we've seen our energy dependency being weaponized. So we will, in this framework, discuss how to reduce our dependence on transit through the Strait. For example, alternative export routes have been created that are more resilient and offer choices, and other routes will be built. For example, a typical one is IMEC. Now turning to Ukraine. We look forward to welcoming President Zelensky tomorrow. Russia's brutal war of aggression has now lasted indeed longer than World War I. And in the face of escalating attacks, Europe keeps up its unwavering support to Ukraine. Our 90 billion euro loan package covers 2/3 of Ukraine's financing needs for this year and for the next year. The first disbursements will come still this month. And for the remaining third, we need Ukraine's partners to step up. This will be a topic at this summit. We are also preparing for the next winter together with Ukraine. And together with Canada, we are leading the preparedness work. And we are joining the pledging efforts of President Macron. And I can announce a contribution of 75 million euros in grant funding for the new safe confinement. Now, you will all recall at our last G7 in Kananaskis, the situation for Ukraine was much more challenging. Today, Ukraine is in a different position. Let me recall. Ukraine is holding the front line and even partially regaining territory. Ukraine has developed the capability to strike strategic targets deep inside Russia. And Ukraine has become a world-leading producer of cutting-edge military equipment. On the other hand, Russia is feeling the strain and pressure. Our sanctions are biting and cutting deep. Putin's war economy has never been as weak. And at the same time, we are anchoring Ukraine in Europe. Today, we open the first cluster of the EU accession negotiations. This is a huge step forward. Ukraine has made remarkable reform progress. They have delivered, so now we have to deliver too. Finally, turning to AI. We have seen impressive advances in frontier models that will drive progress in science and technology. At the same time, these models also multiply the risks. The key question of today is how to introduce new models safely. Now, testing before entry into service, that is not new. It is very much what we are used to, for example, for airplanes and medical devices. Here, cooperation of G7 countries is paramount. We should exchange information and ensure cooperation of independent entities that are evaluating models before their market release. The other important dimension is how to reap the benefits of the AI revolution. And here, adoption is key. Europe and the United States are at par in terms of AI adoption, but we all know that much more needs to be done in terms of industrial AI and transforming our manufacturing. The G7 countries have to win the battle of adoption, and for that, it's all about application, application, and again, application. We, as you know, as European Union have recently presented the tech sovereignty package to drive AI innovation in Europe. We want our own AI future, not in isolation, that's very important, but together with our trusted partners. My final point, we are protecting children online. I want to thank President Macron for tabling this crucial topic, because the opportunities of the digital world are clear, but so are the risks. The debate is not whether young people should have access to social media. The debate is whether social media should have access to our children and teenagers, and when. And here the case for social media delays because of the risks is getting stronger. We all know that childhood and early adolescence are formative years for the brain functioning, but most importantly also for the development of a personality. Children need to develop their skills to act with autonomy, offline, but of course also online. And we need to give them the protection, the time to mature, and of course, the means to do so. There is also a vast responsibility of the tech companies. In Europe, platforms must prove that they are safe by design, and this principle is especially important for our children and teenagers. So you see, we have a lot to work about ahead of us. And the results of this summit will feed into our discussion that we will then have at the end of the week at the European Council back in Brussels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I will now open the floor for questions. The first one goes to ARD.
Yeah, thank you. Katrin Schmidt, German Public TV, ARD. Madam President, my question is on EU sanctions against Iran. Given the news now on the agreement and given the statements of several European heads of states in the morning that they consider lifting sanctions, what is your approach on that? Is the EU also considering lifting sanction, and which?
So we have a framework of sanctions that is responding to two main features. The one is the violation of human rights, and the other one is mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. And the principle of sanctions is that we need real change on the ground before we can think about lifting them. Sanctions are in place to change behavior. So if behavior is changing credibly and verifiably, then you can lift sanctions. But the other way around is also true. As long as there is no behavioral change, you cannot lift the sanctions because of human rights violation and weapons of mass destruction.
Okay. Vitaly?
Thank you, Vitaly Sizov, Freedom TV channel. Do you expect that the President of the United States will support this EU three-piece approach that was presented in London and supported by fourth leader? And are you ready to act without active support of the United States in this approach or with limited support? And the second point, will you discuss this new model of EU accession for Ukraine, which promoted by Germany with like partial accession, not like acceleration of accession, but new model? Thank you.
Well, for sure, we will not discuss here in the G7 the internal issues of the European Union, but in the next European Council, we will address the enlargement issues, because they are broad consensus that we need to accelerate this process, not only when we talk about Ukraine, but also when we talk about Moldova and the Western Balkan countries. We had a very good summit with the Western Balkans, and I think now we need to build up on this momentum to move forward on enlargement.
Andrea had a question.
This is Andrea Palashana from Bloomberg News. Madam President, I have a question for you. We know you will discuss AI, as you mentioned. People have been warning for a long time about the risk of being overly dependent on US AI systems. And Mark Carney warned against it again yesterday. And the latest decision against Anthropic seems to give it some credence. So how will the EU act on this? And my second question is, we reported some progress on the SAFE agreement signature with France this week. Are you able to confirm that? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would like the opportunity to test my French.
It's very good, your French.
J'ai une très bonne nouvelle. Mercredi, nous signerons un accord de prêt, SAFE, avec la France pour plus de 15 milliards d'euros. Grâce à sa forte industrie de défense, la France est un acteur clé de la sécurité européenne. SAFE aide les États membres à renforcer leurs capacités, soutenir leur industrie de défense et aider l'Ukraine. Plus de 78 milliards d'euros sont désormais engagés, soit plus de la moitié de l'enveloppe SAFE. Ces investissements couvriront 9 domaines critiques des systèmes anti-drones aux missiles et munitions. SAFE soutiendra aussi nos grands projets européens comme l'initiative de défense anti-drone et la surveillance du flanc Est. And the first part of your question was, give me a buzzword.
My first question was about being dependent on
Yeah.
companies and how the EU will deal with this.
So we've just tabled indeed as a commission the proposal of tax sovereignty and building with the tax sovereignty proposal own structures. For us, it's important, as I've said, not in isolation, but reaching out to trusted partners. But of course, we have to have our own infrastructure and our own footprint. The fact that we're building, for example, now the gigafactories is also an answer to your question. The gigafactories will enable our startups, for example, to test their models on a public infrastructure. That is of utmost importance because we have amazing startups, but we don't want them then to move away from the European Union, but to test their models and train their models and therefore improve their models on AI gigafactory, for example. But the same is semiconductor topic, the cloud topic. The tax sovereignty package is telling the story of this work.
Okay, the last question goes to Reuters.
Hello, Julia Payne from Reuters. I have two questions, one on China and critical minerals. On China, France has tried to give cooperation with China a chance with the phone call last week. How do you think that went? What sort of action or stances are you pushing to achieve at this summit? And do you think it's still possible?
Did you get the question?
Is it about the critical raw materials in China?
Yeah. And who had a call with whom?
Can you please
sorry.
repeat your question, Julia?
It's VTC that we had.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, and since that VTC, what is the EU pushing to achieve at this summit on China? Anything concrete? And do you think it's still possible to avoid a trade war given China keeps warning that it'll take countermeasures? And then on critical minerals, how does the EU envision a potential critical minerals trading bloc given the US seems keen to sign legally binding bilateral agreements? I mean, is it going to be G7 led, US led? How might it look?
So on critical minerals, indeed, we see a concentration of critical minerals in China. So the possibility to have the critical minerals and to process them. And we have experienced already last year what it means if they are used to reduce the production capacity in the European Union. Last year, fall, we had for a few weeks critical mineral export controls with consequences in our economy. That is not the only reason, but it also showed us how important it is that we diversify, not to be over-dependent of a single supplier. And for that, it is important first to have the dialogue with China about what we observe in the attempt to have a change of behavior. Second, to work on our own potential of critical minerals in the European Union, for example. There is quite some potential, but it will take time. And the third is a very important leg. This is working with trusted partners and other countries around the world that have critical minerals and to have critical mineral agreements with them. My experience is with Global Gateway, we work very much on these critical raw materials, for example, in other countries, that these countries often have the natural resources. What they don't want is what they often see with Chinese investors, that these investors take the raw material, process it in China, and the added value goes to China and doesn't stay in the country itself. So our principle with Global Gateway, but also with free trade agreements that we have, is to work together in so far that the extraction of the critical mineral leads to creating a value chain locally, therefore create in the country itself jobs and the development of an economy, and then work with them with a processed critical mineral, for example, to deliver to the European Union. So you see, it's a wide approach. The more like-minded countries join this effort, the more we will have fairness and a level playing field where this important topic is concerned.
Okay, well, this concludes our press conference. Thank you very much. Have an excellent afternoon and a good summit. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. President,